I'm so used to moving, because I talk about when I walk into the teaching space, I like to make it black space. But you know what? I don't have to worry here, because look, I can't even hardly see anyone with these glasses, but I know it's black space. So, deadly. I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I stand today. I pay respect to their elders, past and present, and more importantly, I really, really pay respect to the future leaders. So you young fellas out there, I'm on your side. My present, can people hear me? Yes? Yeah, it's like, and I'm nervous, so you'll hear me blur. And I do that a lot, I remind a lot. So my presentation today speaks to teaching Indigenous Studies in a university context. The title of it is called Teaching Indigenous Studies, the Raced Body Performing Human as Praxis. And I borrow from Catherine McKendrick's book, Sylvia Winter, on Being Human as Practice, 2015. So I know that being human is a social construct, okay? Because for too long we've been dehumanised, and I'll talk about that a bit more. So when I enter the space of learning and teaching, I actually enter it as Yirinji McBarbara. And for a long time we haven't been allowed to be who we are. We're always, as people are saying, as the speakers before me, we're always performing a particular identity. And I think sometimes we wear a mask. And so what I'd like to do, and what I'm thinking about, is if I consider myself as human, even though understanding it's a social construct, if I think about myself as a human, then I can start to unpack, I can start to decolonise, I can start to deconstruct, I can start to disrupt, I can start to rapture, all of those wonderful words that make you feel real, you know, like you're in the fight. So being human as praxis is an action word, and I really, praxis is action, and as an educator we talk about praxis a lot. So I kind of like that idea. Now, who am I looking out for time? I got you, Helen. All right, so now what I got to do? I think this is, yeah. So I've been reading this book called Habeas Vixus, and Habeas Vixus talk about you shall have the flesh. So Alexandra G. Wahili talks about how he understands racialized assemblages, and how assemblages being raced, the body that's raced, actually carries with it everything that takes us into a contemporary space, or takes us, you know, when we journey through our life. And that's due to Western understandings of our bodies. So he says, overall, I construe race, racialisation and racial identities as ongoing sets of political relations that require, through constant perpetuation by institutions, discourses, practices, desires, infrastructures, languages, technologies, sciences, dreams and cultural artefacts, the barring of the non-white subject from the category of the human as it is performed in the modern West. So in looking at Whaley's book, Habeas Vixus, You Shall Have the Flesh, I am attempting to examine how my consideration of self and how I carry myself into the space. Before this, I had up some questions, and I took it off, and those questions were, when you walk into a space as an Indigenous, or as a woman, as a feminist, as an Aboriginal person, as someone who's visibly seen as coloured or black, you know. The questions were, what are the students thinking? Like, how do you, and I guess that's where Dennis and Dave are starting to say, okay, there's a cognitive kind of response, you know, that triggers, things are being triggered. Questions in their own head are being triggers. It's not my job to understand that, but I do think through what does that mean. And so what I've tried to do is think about the idea of, okay, I'm human, you're human, let's work together. But again, it can be hard. So what I'm trying to say is that when I consider myself as Indigenous, as community member and educator, it requires, I would argue, that I connect intimately to who I am and what I bring to the space. I carry all of me into the teaching spaces, and all that I have experienced, all that I am going to experience, and the experiences that I have experienced. So in considering the lens of Waheli's quote, I want to note how the category of the human is performed in the spaces of education. In transferring knowledge, I recognise that my body is racialised, and I therefore carry the assemblages of racialisation. These racialized assemblages have named me within Western epistemological knowledge production as non-human, subhuman, fauna and flora, and you all know what I'm saying because we've all experienced it, fauna and flora, and at one with nature. I know these tags, thus entering the spaces of teaching, I desire, as I've already stated, the need to disrupt and to challenge the colonised space to one of safety and wellness, where it does become black, where it does become Indigenous space, where it does become black woman Indigenous space. And I think sometimes we don't even think about that, you know, because we know all our mob and our women are leaders in our community, and we don't think that we are, you know, we just think of ourselves as Aboriginal. I shouldn't say that because who am I to speak for others? So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that we actually engage in the space as Indigenous. Breathe, Faye. So I put this photo up because if I'm going to talk, if I'm going to critique, if I'm going to think about this idea of being human as praxis, then I need to actually critique why I think. So you may wonder why this photograph is here. You may wonder why I'm putting it up. But it's a photographs like this that is so often placed in our PowerPoint teaching, you know, slides. It's put there, and then it's gone. And you've got about 500, 600 students, pre-service teachers, sitting in your classroom or in the lecture theatre, and there's no decoding, there's no concept of why. Why did that photo get used? What is it about that photo? So what I wanted to do was actually start to decode it, start to unpack it. So this photo sits within the frame of public access, and I do want to acknowledge if there are family members connected. This is the Western Australian photos of West Australian people in the northwest of WA. It was used as a photo to talk about, in some ways, to talk about humanitarian kind of process. Our Aborigines aren't being looked after properly. So how do we talk about that when we talk to students? And in my masterclass, I've started to put this photo out there, and I've started to ask students to think about what is this photo telling you? What do you think? Why? You know, and it's a bit like you guys, Dave and Dennis, and you know, you have to start to see the tools to deconstruct. You have to use the resources to be able to actually have these kind of conversations. And yes, they are uncomfortable, you know, and yes, they are emotional. And yes, there's like, I didn't know that kind of stuff. And so what it does is it actually allow a conversation to actually take place. Okay. So this one, I argue, when I'm looking at it, it talks about intimacy. So I'm looking at the idea of colonialism, the intimacy between the coloniser and the colonised bodies. And so I'm arguing in my PhD that it's an intimate process. It's, you know, because there's violence in the way that these processes have caused Indigenous peoples as we are in the contemporary, and all the health stuff that we have to go through. So I'm looking at it in that kind of context. So I'm bearing witness to this photo, and it reveals the erasure of First Peoples' bodies as flesh and as human. It's denied through the marking and making of who is and who is not human, who is and who is not Australian, within the context of imperialism and the establishment of the colonised nation of Australia. In consideration of the right to examine this photo, I approach with caution, knowing that the men in this photograph could be from any language groups, as Chris Owen's book that came out, in 2016, Western Australian. So it could be the Warragon, the Jarragan, the Nulanglu. Apologise for the way I'm saying this. I should really learn how to speak. That's my fault. And the Bunbunban groups, which was made up of clan groups of the east and west of Western Australia. I acknowledge and pay my respect to the many family members in the contemporary, and I think that's an important concept because I don't want this to be voyeurism. I don't want this to be another look here. I really think that as an educator, as a Yidinji McBarbara person, that it's important to start to see how dehumanisation occurs. And it can be read in a photograph like this. There is no doubt about it. And so when I ask students about it, I get things like, Okay, the sound of chains rattling. What does that mean? The sound of footstep stompings. What do you think's going on? And it's not just this photograph, it's other photographs like this that's out in the public space. Okay? How am I going for time? So I actually think that it offers an opportunity for deeper analysis and a deeper and the raising of critical consciousness. I've sat in meetings where people, teachers, lecturers have said, yeah, I do the critical awareness stuff, but to me that's such a, I don't know, you know how you get something and you want to chew it and it doesn't really make sense and it's just like, oh, hold on a minute. I like the idea of critical consciousness because then I think it actually works to your brain, it decolonises or works within another way, how you think about stuff. Or maybe I'm going on too much. So what I want to do is bring to the fore colonial history, and I think I do that within my teaching area. I want to talk about intimacy, creativity, racialisation and the political justice of bare life and racialised assemblages, as Whaley frames in his book Habitus Vixus. So to journey through teaching Indigenous studies, I want to rehumanise, or I want to detail that we've never really been non-humanised, if that makes sense. So I'm still working through this, so bear with me, okay, as I go through this, people. Okay, where am I? And I want to shift power. To remember my people and our sovereign connective relationship to all that we are, regardless of the processes of colonisation, regardless of wanting the non-Indigenous students to understand exactly what my black body is in that space. To know that when I start to talk like a Murray, it's okay. I don't have to be as articulate as I want to be. Because sometimes the Murray stuff actually makes more sense. The blackfella stuff makes more sense. They're like, oh, okay, she's talking another way. It's very creative. So, you know, we can actually perform. And I do say teaching is a performance, and you have to perform, you know. And if you don't perform in a creative way and in a way that humanises you, then, you know, it's an interesting way to actually go through this journey of teaching so that you're not hurt, or you can be hurt, but so that you're not a victim, I guess, in this context. Because I don't think we ever want to be victims. We're too strong and too powerful, and we've survived a whole lot of stuff. And I think that's the importance when we walk into a classroom with non-Indigenous students and we teach, you know, as an educator teaching education students, they have the power to bring some change, you know, to the space. They can actually start to, you know, think through what they want to, what they would like to understand themselves. So, So turning the gaze back, our reason is situated within the domains of desires, intimacies and the possessiveness of the coloniser towards the colonised. Such possessiveness exists within the agenda of sovereignty and living, as well as a layered palimpsest of ontological, anthological and the humane, I don't know, the something of human and non-human. I could spell it out for you and someone could say, that's what that word is. I do know what it is. In my head I see it, I just cannot pronounce it, of human, non-human, and the way it's played out through colonial and Western understandings of Indigenous peoples in this country. So I also wanted to pose a question. I'd read somewhere that teaching Indigenous study, who is it for? And I think it's an interesting question. Is it for white fellas or is it for black fellas? Like, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's one that we can actually consider or contemplate, and don't ask me a question about it when I sit on the panel, okay? Because I want you guys to have the answer. So that is the reason why I want to decode, deconstruct and disrupt white ways of knowing. How am I going for time? How much?
7 minutes.
Oh, God. Hey, I've got a lot yet to talk about. No, gammon. Okay, so we'll do that quickly. So the positioning of the body and the flesh as habitus vixus, you shall have the flesh. It unpacks and deconstructs the theories of the interconnection of race, assemblage and politics. It redefines and rearticulates the ways of violence and violence of the racialised body and the way it's tied up in the continuation of power within nation states. And I think the speakers before, and I think the speakers that will come after, reveals that through their understanding. So the positioning of the body and flesh as habitus vixus, you shall have the flesh. We understand that Watson, Morton, Robinson, they illuminate the ways that white possession and stealth of lands, bodies, country continues into today, unabated, and it functions through the disciplines of law, political sciences, history and anthropology, manifested in the way that the regulatory mechanism and the making of government policies and legislation. I should maybe go ahead a bit, because I think I've only got 7 minutes. All right, so I'm going to try and do this really quickly. So what I argue is that if the gaze is turned back, then it repositions the power, it gives humanity. So when I think about the men in the chains, I think you have to listen, you have to hear the voice. And if you use your imagination and your critical consciousness to unpack that, then you bring to the fore another kind of narrative, another kind of story, so that they're not silent, they're not muted. And Tina Camp talks about how she listens as a methodology to photographs, because the photographs can tell you something. And so I find that really interesting. And the idea of Kevin Quashie, who talks about the idea of photographs as quiet. And I'm trying to work through that, and how do you bring that into a teaching space, which I find really interesting. So there's probably a lot I'm talking about now. So what's interesting, I think, in the idea of that photograph that I put up is that some students, or when it's just put up there and you flash through it, there's no sense of their right to be seen. It's almost like they're not worthy of life. And if we don't see that, then we can't acknowledge them except as negative stereotypes that have labelled, obviously, men in chains as criminals. And so unpacking that and bringing to the fore the understanding of how you can start to talk about being human is to go through a process of understanding what dehumanisation means. I hope I'm making sense, I really do. So I like this here. Donna Haraway talks about it as, here we go, I'm finding it. Donna Haraway. So the decolonising the mind. When I read Ngugi Wa Thiong'o's book, Decolonising the Mind, I went, oh God, that is such a brilliant book, and it's easily read, and it made me understand how decolonising of the mind is something that we need to also do with our students who are in the classroom. So in Decolonising the Mind, I like this quote where Haraway says, it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots knot knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And I really got that. I thought, I love this. So decolonising the mind and disrupting the ignorance and discomfort, as already been told, discomfort of some students is key to performing our blackness, our indigeneity, our womanness. It is in the tutorial spaces where I introduce issues of surveillance, the panoptical lens that directs its own understanding of the Indigenous body. We discuss the social construction of race and the social construction of human, how we have been race, the privilege of whiteness that defines and continue to benefit from our oppression. I argue that as teachers, there is a need. I argue that teachers also need to work through their own belief system and have critical consciousness for working with Indigenous students and the Indigenous academic. Coming to the end. So, this is a photo. I'm a part of a group, Sister Girls at Flinders University, Office of Indigenous Strategy, and we work through this Bound Unbound, and that's part of our research. It's a creative process, and we've done a few performances. And one of these were 10 bus shelter posters in Adelaide, and we were really worried that some silly child or youth, even though we love youth, would come along and start to graffiti it. We were worried about putting our bodies out there in the public space. And so if you go back to the way that the public access to bodies in chains, engaged reveals a dehumanising process, then what we've tried to do in this thing is to humanise, is to tell you that we're there. Look out, we're watching you. So while we're out in the space, that's what we're doing, I think, in those bus shelters. And we've been blessed and lucky enough to just get a signature on one of the posters in North Adelaide. So that was fine. No one was being rude. We thought there might be, forgive me guys, but we thought there might have been a penis drawn, and we were, all that violence of the body, the woman's body. And so we thought we thought that was the case. So I wanted to say that, however, we as Indigenous scholars ensure that the space is safe and ethical. We're very ethical. We're very generous, us mob. Very generous. You know, it's all about love. And the space is safe and ethical for teaching about the complexities that derive from teaching about us to non-Indigenous peoples. It is a burden we share with love and hope, and we want the receiver of our knowledge to gain understanding that we are sovereign people, that I am Yidinji, that I am McBarbara, that you are Aranda, you are from Wurundjeri, that's who you are. We just haven't been allowed to be that. Now we can perform it. Now we can be it. So we are sovereign peoples that have protocols that recognise and acknowledge the country on which we stand. This image, I argue, or this image is what we wanted to do, was disrupt the circulation of emotion around hate. We disrupt through the way in which the text and the image are situated together as sovereign goddesses. The emotions are social and cultural practices, and they produced, as Ahmed would say, response to the triggers. The images look forward and direct the viewer. They are not images of disadvantage or victimhood, so common in other images about Indigenous people, where the viewer is located as the voyeur. Instead, they are images that challenge the viewer and act as a form of public pedagogy. It is a lens by which to teach, and in conclusion, I would argue that the teaching space is a contested space. It is it's a zone of contact. And we need to know that when we teach through a practice that is love, that is hope, and it's a practice of being human. And I think that's an important context. Have I got any more time, or that's it? Finished? Yeah, finished. Thank you.